this edition of Expert Speak. Today, I'm extremely delighted to welcome Dr. Shankari Sundararaman. She's a professor of Southeast Asian Studies at the Center for Indo-Pacific in the School of International Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. And of course, she is a very, very well-known member of the strategic community in India, a very well-known academic in Southeast Asia and on the overall region. I welcome Dr. Shankari to this series of Expert Speaks. And today, we would like to have a conversation with you on ASEAN perspectives, on dealing with this COVID times.
Right.
Obviously, as we all appreciate, we are entering a new normal. This COVID has changed or promises to change the way the future of the globe works. We hadn't probably predicted it, but here we are as one global community, all stranded. And there are many lessons for all of us. My first question to you would be, how do you see this whole situation unraveling, particularly in terms of the regional outlook?
For asking me to speak with you through this new kind of platform, which is, like you said, is becoming the new normal for all of us. I'm very glad that you asked me to be part of the Expert Speak, portfolio that during this lockdown, and we're also sort of, trying to keep our academic interests and our work going through the digital platform. I think the Asian Confluence is doing a great job in terms of keeping this engagement alive, keeping the academic space alive through this kind of digital platform. So thank you for asking me to speak. And I'm happy to take your questions on this. And the first question you have sort of highlighted is the question of how the ASEAN response or the regional outlook has been through this pandemic, and what are the issues that are likely to be impacting the region while this pandemic takes place. It's interesting that yesterday, a couple of days before, when you asked me to speak with you, I was just recalling the words of a poem that John Donne has written. The name of the poem is For Whom the Bells Toll. And in this, he writes that no man is an island. He says, entire of itself. Each is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. Each man's death diminishes me, for I'm involved in mankind. Therefore, send not to know for whom the bells toll, it tolls for thee. So when I was going through this poem on the day that you asked me to write and speak on the Expert Speak column, it was very interesting because if at all, I think anything captures the essence of what it means to live in this highly globalized space that we are living in, it is these words and the lines that come from this poem. So today, when we look at the information that is coming to us repeatedly through the digital platform on events like the Spanish flu pandemic that happened about 100 years ago, I think what we have to understand is the globe and the world has moved beyond the levels of globalization that existed 100 years back. And today, air travel, the movement of goods and people across so many spaces, and controlling this pandemic under these conditions are much more complex to handle. And I think it's very obvious that we are seeing this kind of complexity unfolding. Now, as far as your question on the regional outlook and the issues relating to concerns in Southeast Asia, I think what I would first do is to actually relate to how a global pandemic of this kind is different in terms of the impact it has on the regional security matters. Normally when we talk in terms of security, we normally refer to the security as it means in the traditional sense, that is where the state becomes the referent point of security. And what this means is that the state or the security of the state is viewed as the primary objective of the agencies of the state. And this actually is more entrenched in an understanding that both in terms of territoriality and sovereignty, the question of the state structure is an inviolable structure. So whenever we've talked about security in the context of, say, international relations, we have always referred to security in the context of the state-related security. But if you take the post-Cold War period, what you see is even within international relations, there are very interesting debates relating to security and how security has now become broadened to encompass both different as well as diverse kinds of security issues. So if you take the broader parameters of security, I think within the context of that, there is a sub-discipline to security studies, which is non-traditional security. And if you look at it within that context also, there is again a sub-classification where we focus on issues relating to human security. So the human security debate is something that has actually emerged from the UN Development Report as long ago as 1994. And you know, if you take that like almost 25 years later, that relevance of the human security debate from the United Nations publication that emerged at that time, I think it was called probably Addressing New Dimensions to Human Security or something like that. Sometime in 1994, it was published. And what it meant was that sometimes the challenge to security may not only be an external enemy state, you know, so I want to put that within quotes, but it could also be from several other directions and could still impact the security of the state. Now, for example, when we are looking at the current pandemic, what we are seeing is the degree of economic losses that have been occurred globally. We are also seeing the impact that it's having on the lives of the citizens of these countries that are very, very severely affected. And so I think what the question of addressing this, you know, security issues relating to the spread of pandemics is also critically important. I think as far as the region of Southeast Asia per se is concerned, I think over almost a period of 3 decades now, what you see is that Southeast Asia as a region itself has been grappling with issues related to this aspect of security. So both from an economic front as well as the health front, Southeast Asia, that in that sense is not new to the context of non-traditional security issues. Because if you take the first case of the Asian financial crisis, which was an economic crisis, that itself was a kind of a non-traditional security issue. Subsequently, you saw that in the initial aftermath of the 97 Asian financial crisis, you have what is called the environmental haze, which started sometime probably in 97, 98. And this affected 3 countries because of the forest fires that took place in the Kalimantan region of Indonesia. So countries like Malaysia and Singapore were equally affected as a result of the environmental haze. And following this, you had outbreaks of the avian flu. You've also had an outbreak in 2002 of the first SARS episode, that is the severe acute respiratory syndrome that took place in 2002. So what you see is the region itself is not new to the context of non-traditional security. But what is important is that when you take the current case of the pandemic, it is very important to understand that this is a one-of-a-kind novel coronavirus, you know. So in that sense, the SARS-CoV-2 or the COVID-19, I think has been relentless in the kind of destruction that it has given. And it has also brought to the surface the unpreparedness of several states, not just in the case of Southeast Asian region, but globally. You see that there has been a case sort of unpreparedness of states to address this kind of an impact. So what you see for the region is that the COVID-19 has been far more aggressive and far more critical to manage in terms of a regional outlook.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. I think you've hit such an important chord of uh, non-traditional security threat, and we were all unprepared, and it is such a big failure of global intelligence
I
to have
swear.
been.
Well, normally you use intelligence in traditional security matters. I think it's complete. It's blindsided the world in that sense, you know.
Yes, yes, absolutely, absolutely. Um, can I ask you, with respect to Southeast Asia, especially the ASEAN countries, if
Okay.
we go at an individual level
Mm-hmm.
per country, how has each of the countries dealt with the case, the pandemic, or are dealing with it rather? Are there some that are faring better rather than others?
Mm-hmm.
Can you throw some light on that?
Okay. You know, when you take the context of how the ASEAN countries have actually responded individually, it's a very interesting. It's very interesting to see that on the one hand, we tend to look upon, in many cases, we tend to look upon the ASEAN as a single unit, you know. And even in terms of the number of reported cases that we're looking from the ASEAN region, I think if I remember correctly, as on maybe 21st or 22nd April, the number of cases had just crossed the 30,000 mark. Okay. Now, what is interesting is that the response of individual countries has been very, very different in the case of ASEAN. And what we need to remember as scholars who look at the ASEAN region is that it comprises of 10 countries, okay? So as a result, there will be diverse methods by which countries have actually addressed the issue. And it is also important for us to remember that, you know, all the countries are not at the same level where it comes to addressing the pandemic. And one of the things I want to point out is that there's been quite a bit of literature on the fact that authoritarian regimes and democracies have addressed the conflict differently or had addressed the case of the pandemic differently. Okay. Now, I don't think this is such a sweeping generalization to make. There are many democracies have handled the COVID-19 very effectively. And there have also been cases where other countries have found it very difficult to cope with the COVID-19. There are countries in Southeast Asia which are like, for example, Vietnam has handled it much better as compared to, say, Indonesia. Okay. Now, when people talk about this authoritarian and democratic shift, it seems that countries like Indonesia or even for that example, Philippines, which are democratic countries, have not handled it as much as well as, say, Vietnam or Singapore. Okay. So it's a very interesting context that you're talking about individual countries and the diversities in that sense. Now, I think what we have to remember is that when we talk about the COVID-19 and we talk about the graph of the rising cases of COVID-19, the rising cases of fatalities related to COVID-19, and I think we've come across this terminology very often that we're talking about what is called flattening the curve. You know, I think it is interesting because flattening the curve is dependent very much on individual countries' responses. And what we have to see, while there can be regional responses, because regional responses, I will address it in the next question perhaps, but what we have to understand is that when we take the question of individual country responses, it is also important for us to know how the center or the government, central government in these countries is taking out certain measures and how the provincial regions of the countries are responding to the measures. Both of these issues have to go actually hand in hand in order for us to realize how to deal or how this curve is actually flattened by individual countries. Now, in the case of, say, countries where you see the leadership taking a very effective role, I found this very interesting because the leadership must be very clear that it wants to address the question of containment of this pandemic immediately. So governments which were decisive, for example, I think the case of Vietnam and Singapore, you see that governments were extremely decisive in the measures that they took. They implemented the entire question of the public health screening almost immediately. Issues like contact tracing measures, because that's another significant thing, because the minute one person is affected, the possibility of that person affecting multiple people ensures that we need to have very effective contact tracing. So the contact tracing measures by countries like Singapore and Vietnam were far more important and far more effective. Another thing we saw was the manner in which countries shut down both air travel and international as well as domestic air travel, because both domestic and international air travel had the or just travel, not just by air, even by railroads and other options, had the possibility of addressing the movement of people. And this is where we saw that countries were able to do far more better. Now, if you take, for example, the cases of leadership, in my view, which have not been very effective, I think the case of Cambodia will stand out in the case of Southeast Asia, because both in the case of Cambodia as well as in the case of the Philippines, what you have seen is that both these countries, the leadership has used the COVID-19 as an option to consolidate their own powers, and this is very interesting, because it is, when, as it is in some of these countries of Southeast Asia, there has been what you call a quasi-authoritarian kind of a system in place, all right? But when you are faced with a pandemic of this kind, the leadership determines whether you're going to move towards redressal at the local level, or you're going to use it as a measure to boost a political leader's position in terms of the kind of powers they have. So what you see is in the case of Cambodia, both Prime Minister Hun Sen as well as President Duterte in the context of the Philippines have actually called for greater emergency powers. They have also, as far as I know, the Cambodian parliament has passed a law which says that Hun Sen will have new sweeping powers in face of this pandemic, okay? So he will be able to exercise certain powers which he would not have been able to exercise had the pandemic not been there. So similarly, Duterte too has actually spoken about this kind of sweeping emergency powers where he will have a hold of it. The second issue, I think, is that we have to, if you take most of these countries, you have to also address the context of the response of governments immediately. What you see across the region is that individual countries have responded differently to how individual governments actually have responded differently to how they have to address the question of the pandemic itself. So many countries, for example, where there has been a question of concern over the risk of economic losses, have actually responded much poorer than those who have been willing to take economic losses as one of the fallouts of this pandemic, So you see that again, in the case of Vietnam, the question of short-term fallout from the crisis was very clear. They said that the economic fallout would be there. And you see this again in the case of Singapore. But in the case of, for example, Indonesia, Indonesia's entire position was that it would be safer to continue to ensure that economic impact was not there. It did not even worry. It continued to promote itself as a tourist destination. So as a result, it continued to keep its borders and its airports and travel options open. So the cases that you see in the context of Indonesia are very different. There's been a very rising number of cases in Indonesia because the government's response, and I'm very surprised with the Indonesian case, because given the mandate that President Joko Widodo has received just last year in his second term, he literally won the elections by about 55% of the majority votes. So as a result, I would have anticipated that that President Joko Widodo would have been a much more effective leader at this time, rather than allowing the worries related to the economy to actually impact the region. And for example, one of the aspects that I think, again, I would like to take the example in the case of Malaysia. Now, what you see in the case of Malaysia is that, you have in 2018, you have the popular election coming with, Mahathir coming to power. But then in the following, if you see in the aftermath of Mahathir stepping down from power, the new prime minister has actually delayed the parliament and decision making in the parliament by some months now. Okay, so as a result, because there has been a no confidence vote, there has been a question of addressing civil issues as well as medical issues has not been very successful in the context of Malaysia. And so I think several countries you see have responded very, very differently in the context of Southeast Asia. Thailand, again, an example, that Thailand has actually done better than several of the other countries, because regardless of the fact that, one anticipated the Thai leadership may not have a very, very effective role, I think Thailand has been able to limit the number of cases, and it has been far more effective. And there is also one interesting fact, that Thailand's medical facilities in a comparative sense, say for example, if you compare the medical facilities in Thailand with the medical facilities in Vietnam, Thailand has globally ranking medical facilities. So its approach has been much more different at the state level than Vietnam. In the case of Vietnam, for example, the only option was to curb movement, and a lockdown kind of a situation was a better option, because Vietnam saw prevention being better than cure as the model to adopt, So individual countries have actually differed in the way in which they have addressed the question of the COVID crisis.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that very lucid elaboration of what each country is doing. I think that's extremely informative, and which brings me to my next question, which is about Vietnam, the chair of the ASEAN as of now, the current chair.
Right.
And as the chair, how is Vietnam addressing the issue of an ASEAN response to a regional response to COVID-19?
Okay. See, if you take the context of Vietnam as the chair of the ASEAN for the year 2020, I think Vietnam actually has the onerous task of bringing the ASEAN together on issues and in terms of approaching it at a regional level. Okay. So while my previous answer covers what Vietnam has been doing at an individual level, I will leave that out in this question, because here I think the response should be to look at how Vietnam is acting as the chair of the ASEAN. And I think this is critical from Vietnam's point of view, because it will reflect on how it has handled the crisis and how it has been at the forefront of this crisis, especially because of the need for the governments to decide on the lockdown that was accepted, across most of these countries. Now, if you take the case at the regional level as chair of the ASEAN, Vietnam has actually been able to move forward on some areas at the regional responses. And interestingly, it is not just the 10 members of ASEAN, but also the ASEAN +3 that has been part of the regional level responses. And this is very interesting, because as early as maybe about 10 days back, it must have been on the 14th of April or the 15th of April, there was an ASEAN member states meeting. There was a special summit of the ASEAN member states to address the question of the COVID-19. And this was done through a video conferencing method. Okay. So this is very similar to what Prime Minister Modi did in terms of having a SAARC level meeting to address, the South Asian regional context, So ASEAN, because of its official processes, decided that the COVID-19 meeting should be conducted. And what the meeting sort of decided was that there will be no end on the free movement of goods, okay? It also decided, because intra-ASEAN levels of trade are slightly higher than the context of, say, South Asia. So the question of the free movement of goods was not supposed to be stopped. It also looked at whether there could be a regional response in terms of supplying what is called the hazmat, that is the hazardous material suits that are used by the health workers. So in terms of addressing the supply of hazmat suit for health workers, the regional response addressed that we should be able to coordinate regional level responses so that countries that are worst affected have access. This is a little like what the EU has done in cases of addressing, medical supplies and health supplies across the European Union, where countries that were more affected have been, have been dependent on less affected countries for the procurement of health facilities. So in Southeast Asia too, the ASEAN members have decided to bring hazmat suit for health workers across this free movement of goods in that context. Even the question of getting health kits, the question of getting supplies for pharmaceutical supplies, as well as ensuring there is no shortage of food during the pandemic. I think one of the responses we have to factor in is that many of these countries are also worried that if the pandemic leads to shortage of food, it will also lead to a system where you will see a complete collapse of the civic order and you will see riots on the street, because food stability is going to be very critical as far as countries are concerned. So one of the addresses that regional level it did was to address the question of these factors. Now, on the same day, the ASEAN also met with its 3 East Asian partners, that is what is called the ASEAN +3. And they all agreed to, ensure the flow of commodities, basically goods and commodities could continue to flow across these borders. They also agreed that food and medical supplies should be allowed free of any kind of trade barriers at this time. They also agreed that health related equipment and kits for testing, things like that should not be subject to any kind of tariff issues. They also agreed that, if you take the fact that mainland Southeast Asia shares a border with China, okay? For example, the countries of mainland Southeast Asia share a border with China, especially Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, and Cambodia. Not Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam. So if you take these countries, they said even on the border areas, the question of being able to address shortages in food supplies, the question of being able to address any kind of, say, socio-economic disparities that are arising across the borders as a result of the pandemic, all these have to be addressed through this kind of a multilateral kind of a regional mechanism. One of the interesting things that I want to point out is that immediately after this meeting, the ASEAN has actually revitalized one of its institutional mechanisms. There is something called the ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance on Disaster Management. It is called the AHA Center, okay? Now this center is actually about at least 10 to 12 years old, and it has never been activated because, I won't say it was not activated, it has never been in use, so to say, until currently. So as a result of this, you see a greater boost being given to the AHA Center in order to address the question of the pandemic. I think the fourth decision that was taken during the ASEAN +3 meeting was the question of sharing information across these countries, because information sharing automatically means that you are a little ahead of the battle, because that becomes the basis on which decisions at the government level gets taken. And the other option has also been the question of addressing whether a multilateral funding can come out of, in order to address the crisis, because I recall that even when the Asian financial crisis happened in 1997, there was a question of having a multilateral fund that will address economic matters, in terms of financial crisis, countries that suffered the financial crisis. So I think what they have decided now at the ASEAN +3 level is to look at whether they can optimize this form of multilateral funding so that countries that are struggling will be able to fall back on some assistance from the region itself. And above everything, I think one of the important aspects, I think, which we have to keep in mind is that for ASEAN, this is also being seen as a event when it has to worry and focus on its own centrality. I think the kind of speculation that we're seeing between the United States and China, it's actually the gap between the kind of powers the US and China represent is growing at the regional and global level. And you're seeing this in terms of the kind of speculation that is coming out on the origins of the virus, how the virus has been transmitted, how it has gone transnational. I mean, these are areas which are still a lot of research and a lot of study is yet to be done. But given this kind of information that is coming related to these aspects, I think what is important for ASEAN as a grouping is that it needs to focus on the entire question of ASEAN's centrality and how that centrality and the issue of responding at a regional level becomes very important. And not only is that important at the level of the 10 members of ASEAN, but it also becomes equally important in terms of expanding that 10 membership to include the ASEAN +3 initiative.
Yeah, I think, thank you. I think you raised the issue of ASEAN centrality, which is so, which crystallizes as an issue so clearly in such times,
Yeah. It sort of crystallizes the responses of ASEAN, because there is no way that at a time when you see the United States and the Chinese having the kind of standoff that they are doing currently, there is no way that the ASEAN can afford to forget about its own centrality.
Absolutely.
At least in terms of regional responses for Southeast Asia and East Asia.
Absolutely. Which brings me to my next question, which is bringing it closer home, to South Asia.
Okay.
and in the context of South Asia and in the context of India in South Asia, India has had an Act East policy, which has many aspects, but one of them is dealing with talking to our neighbors, more regional cooperation with our immediate neighbors as the neighborhood first policy. There are other mechanisms such as the Bay of Bengal community, and of course, our Prime Minister has reached out to the SAARC nations also. I mean, yeah. So on all that count, if we narrow it down to something that where South and Southeast Asia meet as a land, it brings us to the northeastern region of India.
Yes.
And there are many infrastructure and connectivity projects on, with a larger goal of connecting South and Southeast Asia, really. And how do you think, in light of the COVID-19, the impacts on the economy, the global scenario unfolding, how do you think the regions of Northeast India will be able to move ahead with the agenda of integration, and not only with Southeast Asian on one side, ASEAN is our Myanmar. There's a trilateral highway with Myanmar, which is coming up through Manipur and the Manipur, Myanmar, India, Myanmar, Thailand. And of course, then we have projects with Bangladesh, with Bhutan, the BBIN countries.
Correct.
So it's a complex mesh of activity, not only on physical connectivity, but digital connectivity, power. All of these areas are being engaged with. how do you see cooperation panning out, the projects that are underway panning out
Okay.
in the region, in light of what's happened?
Okay. Well, if you actually look at the question of the Northeast, I think the focus on the region has been critical, both under the Look East and the Act East policy. So I will not make a distinction that it is only under the Act East policy that the
Sure.
Northeast is critical, but I think both under the Look East as well as the Act East policy. Now, as a Southeast Asian studies scholar, I think there is, I don't think there is a huge difference between the Look East and the Act East policies, particularly in the context of the Northeast, because even at the time of the Look East policy, it was believed that the region of the Northeast could act as the land link to the rest of Southeast Asia. And today, even under the Act East policy, this is being emphasized as a role for the Northeast. Now, I think where the question of a distinction is there between, say, the Look East and the Act East policies, I would probably say the question is on the issue of deliverables, especially related to the issues of connectivity. Okay, so almost from around 2003, when the India-ASEAN Comprehensive Economic Agreement was signed, there was a focus on improving connectivity so as to facilitate the easy mobility of trade in goods and people through this land link that was seen. And the focus of this kind of using the Northeast as a link to the Southeast Asian region had a twofold purpose. One was, when you actually see the case of, say, border regions, I think because of the degree of sensitivity that is associated with border areas, you often see that these areas tend to remain sort of less integrated into the economic policies of our foreign policy or the economic aspects of our foreign policy. Now, second, if you look at the case of border areas, especially in the case of Northeast, what you see huge development gaps that exist between the rest of the country and the case of the Northeast. Now, remote border areas always tend to show larger gaps as compared to urban centers. And I think this is where the question of addressing economic development in the Northeast becomes a very critical factor, not only from within the context of India's economic development, but also from the context of how certain foreign policy initiatives can address, in reducing these gaps in the economics in terms of the border areas. Now, in the context of connectivity, because you mentioned the whole question of connectivity, I think my sense is that there will be delays in achieving the connectivity that we are speaking about, because you specifically mentioned the context of the trilateral highway that is linking India, Myanmar, and Thailand through the trilateral highway. What I think is that because these connectivity projects have been in place almost since, say, 2002. Okay, and I think one of the problems has been that we have seen a certain degree of delivery deficit as far as the implementation and the completion of these connectivity projects is concerned. So what I believe is that COVID-19 may cause a further delay, but COVID-19 will not be the only instrumental reason for this delay. You get my point? I think we need to make a distinction on how the pandemic will actually impact the region, okay? So what I see is that while the COVID-19 may be one factor that will contribute to a further delay, there have already been delays, and I'm pretty critical about this fact that there have already been delays as far as our connectivity projects are concerned. As for the second part of your question, when you're speaking about achieving the levels of integration with the rest of the Southeast Asian region, I think the completion of connectivity will not stop because of the COVID pandemic also, okay? It's a kind of a catch-22 situation. The pandemic is definitely going to impact the global economy for a while, but I also believe that nothing is permanent, and even the pandemic is not going to be a permanent feature of our lives. So what I see is the issues of Northeast integration with the wider region will have implications across a range of spectrums, such as political, economic, and even social spectrums. Now, what to my mind is that there will be one more spectrum that is added to it, which will be the health spectrum, okay? Because as I recall, when we were much younger and we used to travel to various countries, there used to always be a health related query, and we also had to show a certificate which ensured that we were inoculated or given vaccines for various diseases while crossing borders. This was in the 70s and 80s, you know, which is very, very common, that you had to have certain injections or vaccines before traveling to a country. And I think that as we go on, when the vaccine is ready, you will actually see that these kind of restrictions will again come into place, particularly because this form of novel coronavirus has been so new to the current scenario that we are, you know, we find ourselves in. So having said that, I think that, you know, even though we're in the midst of this crisis, I don't think it's difficult for us to, I don't think we should assume that we're going to be stuck in this state permanently. You know, that's a very different kind of a scenario. You know, if you take the question of human endeavor has been through experiences that are far more than the last 100 days of the pandemic that we are seeing, you know. So in that sense, I feel that eventually there will be a space when things open up, and you will see that the question of infrastructure development as well as the question of the Northeast integration will again become a part of our foreign policy focus. But what I see as immediate issues which will be happening, say, within the context of ending the lockdown, would be that there will be certain necessary precautions that will be in place. You will have to ensure the kind of social distancing issues that will be in place. You will also have to continue to understand that some sectors will function because these are essential sectors, but the opening up will be slow in terms of which are the hot spots in the Northeast, and then how these hot spots are going to be addressed, which are the areas that are in the green zone, and then how systematically you can address the problem and move forward on the question of both connectivity as well as integration.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, we certainly appreciate that, you know, the Act East policy is not only a continuation and a strengthening of the Look East policy.
Exactly.
So it's in the same direction. So and of course, all of these projects have been there for a long time, which sort of brings me to my last question,
okay,
which is that in the context of South Asia, and I'll stick to the Eastern South Asian region, which is the Northeast and the neighboring and our neighbors with the BBIN countries and the Bay of Bengal countries and Myanmar, which is one of our nearest ASEAN neighbor.
Correct.
We have land borders.
Right.
We have borders which there are land customs posts, but there are also porous borders.
Mm-hmm.
And there is informal movement of people and
yes.
goods.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
informal trades through those
yes.
borders.
Yes.
Which Asian Confluence has been doing, having some engagements with border communities being headquartered in the Northeast. Mm-hmm. And we've seen that even during these times, there are reports of informal movements through borders, you know?
Okay. Mm.
Yeah. And even when the lockdown ends, right now the formal borders are closed, but even when the lockdown ends, something to be noted is that much of the trade through the borders happens at an informal level.
Exactly.
As you well know.
Yes.
So which brings me to my question is that how do you see, the learnings from COVID, where quarantine and health aspects, certifications, more, the rules of, the fair, movement of people, safe movement of people and goods is going to become underlined and necessary. How do you see those mechanisms being unfolded, where we have so much of porosity at the borders
Yes,
and so much
yes.
informality at the borders, and also I have a also another question in this same line, which is ASEAN has also land borders with each other, and of course there's much more integration in the ASEAN region
Right.
as far as connectivity and of goods and people. But are there any sharings, are there any learnings that Eastern South Asia can have from the ASEAN context in general, of course, but also in how in the post-COVID times, especially the health aspect and other aspects that will be crystallizing up?
Right. Let me first address your question, which is on the question of informal trade. I think what you've really put a very important issue on board for us to recall and sort of think over. I mean, if you take the case of the significance of the Northeast, I think what you have to understand is that the levels of informal trade in the region, I think it probably amounts to around 85 to 90%.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
85 to 90% of the trade in the region
Yes.
is through informal trade. And one of the other things I think which we need to bear in mind is that when you take the context of informal trade, I think we also have to understand that sometimes those agents who are involved in informal trade also tend to be women. Okay, so
Yes.
this is one interesting factor as far as the Northeast is concerned. So this is going to have two kinds of effect, that is both in terms of the role that women have had in terms of informal trade, as well as how it impacts the economy, because sometimes this form of informal trade is the sole source of income in the region also. So as a result, I think, especially due to the closure of borders, this form of trade will be impacted, affecting the livelihoods of people in the Northeast. This form of lockdown actually does not impact all the regions of the country equally. I mean, this is where I wanted to say that when you're saying that there has been some evidence that the informal trade has continued, it's a reality, because when a border is porous, those who are living on the fringes of that border, I mean, there is going to be some degree of overlap. There is going to be some degree of, interaction across those regions. So for us to ensure the full closure of these kind of forms of informal trade may be very, very difficult. But it is in that sense a kind of a catch-22 situation, because on the one hand, if you keep the borders open, the question of infection rates may be far higher in the region. On the other hand, if you keep the borders closed, the question is that it's going to have an impact on livelihoods and the economy. So this is going to be a critical area for the government to address in terms of various key economic aspects that will have to be addressed when the question of lifting the lockdown actually takes place. The second thing I wanted to state is that, when you have a certain degree of informal trade and you have a kind of a pandemic that we're facing like this at the current stage, I think what we have to understand is that, say, for example, following the end of the lockdown on the 3rd of May, as we are anticipating currently, because we still have one more week to go when the lockdown will be lifted on the 3rd of May, and the hope of the lockdown being lifted is there. I think there will be a gradation in terms of how we address or the kind of areas that will be opened, the kind of sectors that will be opened. And I think, especially if you take the case of trade and informal sectors, that will also have to be addressed in terms of, because this is a huge livelihood issue for the Northeast. Now, apart from that, what I see as an issue is that once the border is opened, okay, there has to be more long-term solutions as to how you will deter the spread of COVID-19 until a vaccine eventually comes up. So it's not going to be a case where the borders will open, you'll go back to the levels of informal trade, you will go back to forgetting that you have been in a lockdown or that you need to maintain certain, like you said, certain practices relating to social distancing or maintaining hygiene and stuff like that. It is going to be a situation because it has to be very carefully monitored on the ground, you know. And I think that's one of the key elements that's going to be extremely important, especially in addressing the kind of risks that come with informal trade, kind of risks that come with opening up of the border areas. The other thing that I think will have very important implications is that once you open up that border trade again, it will have not just, because you're saying, because the borders are like this, Bangladesh is there, Nepal, Bhutan, BBIN context. You've also shared the context of Myanmar and the informal border trade on the Myanmar-India border. I think what you have to understand is that this kind of a health pandemic is going to have, it's not just about containment within India, it will also have implications at the bilateral and multilateral levels. You know, so that is going to be a very critical factor. So to address this will be very, very important on multiple levels. The second part of your question related to the lessons that one can actually learn or derive for South Asia from the context of, say, Southeast Asia or the ASEAN countries, which I find actually interesting because, you know, as people who look at the Southeast Asian region, there is also sometimes we have this entire notion of how ineffective ASEAN is as a grouping, okay? Now, it's interesting that at a time like this, we are taking the ASEAN as an example as to how South Asia may be able to address some of its issues. And that's very interesting because I think when we see the ASEAN mechanism, it has been ineffective in terms of addressing issues that fall under the context of traditional security matters, okay? So issues like territorial disputes, the South China Sea conflict, this is where you see ASEAN and its mechanisms floundering somewhat. But they have actually had a pretty good track record of addressing non-traditional security issues. And this is where I think the lessons or the learning for us comes from the ASEAN experience, you know. So for example, when we talk in terms of what are the options for, say, BIMSTEC, BBIN, or even the question of SAARC as a region itself, South Asian region itself, I think the first and foremost, the important issue is the question of whether we can address the issue of information sharing. This itself becomes so critical in the case of South Asia, for example. You know, countries have to be willing to share information on the levels of the infection and the levels that it has spread to. And this is probably the first area that we can maybe start off from. Apart from this, on areas of non-traditional security, the kind of exchange of goods that is possible, the movement of medical supplies, the movement of things that are, pharmaceutical supplies, the movement of, say, health-related kits. These are all areas where countries do not have to engage in real politics. So as a result, when you don't have to engage in real politics, you can actually see this as an opportunity to move forward on areas of humanitarian assistance and, reach out to one another, because the question is that you're not addressing this now as individual countries. This is a pandemic. This is a virus. It doesn't recognize borders. It doesn't recognize airlines. It does not recognize visa controls. It is going to go regardless through the border areas, through contact, through various methods it has spread, okay? So this is something that does not even understand the notions of territoriality and sovereignty. So I think at a humanitarian level, if we are looking for responses, we have to actually ensure that at the non-traditional area of non-traditional security, this is an opportunity to strengthen South Asian regionalism, and this can work as a mechanism or a foundation from where other aspects can sort of, move forward.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that was a very nice note to end this conversation.
Thank you so much, Sabya, for having me on the
It was so illuminating, and I think there are so many lessons and sharings to be done which we haven't done for, say, between South Asia and Southeast Asia. There are mechanisms, of course, but I think at the level of humanitarianism and the people-to-people contacts, and there's so many other areas which would be so useful.
Yes.
So thank you so much, Professor, for coming online.
Okay.
Really appreciate your time.
Thank you,
And
Sabya.
Asian Confluence is doing a series of these, and we want to take what you said in this conversation forward, maybe through some follow-ups.
Okay.
So we will be, seeking your assistance and guidance for that as we move forward. On that note, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me on the Expert Speak and for ensuring that even during this kind of a pandemic and a lockdown, that we remain academically engaged, that we remain, we learn digital friendship because we are, unwilling to use the digital platform to interact. And let's hope that there is light at the end of the tunnel and that we'll see the end of the pandemic and we'll get back to our normal social interactions. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much.
And stay safe and stay sound.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.